Why was everyone laughing? That question echoed in Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne's mind as she stood barefoot on the cold, rubber training mat at Camp Pendleton. The Marine Corps combatives facility smelled of sweat, disinfectant, and quiet arrogance. Around her, tall men in brown shirts and camel trousers stretched their shoulders, chuckled, and whispered things they didn't think she could hear. She didn't need to hear them clearly. She'd heard it all before: the laughter, the disbelief, the doubt that always followed her into a room. It wasn't the first time they'd mistaken her silence for weakness. At 5'4", she didn't look like someone who could throw a man twice her size across a mat. Her frame was compact, her shoulders lean, her hands small enough that her gloves had to be custom-stitched. But there was something in her eyes, calm, cold, unshaken, that made even confident men hesitate when they met her gaze. Not because she looked dangerous, but because she didn't need to prove that she was. The briefing earlier that day had been uneventful until she'd opened her mouth. The Marine instructors were running a joint demonstration between Army Special Operations Support Units and Marine Infantry. It was supposed to be simple. Marines show off their MCMAP techniques while the visiting Army personnel observe, take notes, maybe learn something new. But Hawthorne had made the mistake of asking a question, a technical one. "Why are you teaching the sprawl defense without offsetting the base leg?" she asked. That was it, a simple observation. But the tone in the room shifted instantly. Staff Sergeant Torres, tall, broad, a wall of muscle with years of MCMAP instruction behind him, had looked at her like she'd just questioned gravity. The laughter started small, like a low ripple, then spread until even the junior Marines were smirking. "She thinks she's gonna teach us how to fight," one said under his breath. "Looks like she'd snap if someone sneezed," another added. And yet she didn't react. She only tilted her head slightly, studying Tor's stance. She wasn't there to compete. She'd come as a logistics coordinator, temporarily assigned after finishing a year teaching special operations combatives at Fort Liberty. But they didn't know that. To them, she was just another admin soldier, someone who handled supply chains, not chokeholds. When the Brigadier General arrived, Mitchell, a broad-shouldered veteran of Force Recon, the laughter softened into stiff silence. He had the quiet authority of a man who'd seen enough combat to know the difference between noise and substance. From the elevated platform, he scanned the group, and his gaze stopped when Hawthorne shed her ACU jacket. His eyes caught on the small, embroidered badge over her t-shirt. A Special Operations Combatives Instructor qualification. Few in the entire Army had earned it, fewer still had taught it. The general's lips curled just slightly, like a man watching a storm forming where no one else saw the clouds. He didn't say anything, not yet. He simply crossed his arms and observed. Now standing on the mat, Hawthorne could feel every pair of eyes on her. The Marines were lined up, waiting for her to embarrass herself. That was the part no one said out loud, but everyone expected. The smallest person in the room, the only woman, the one who didn't belong. Her breathing slowed. The chatter faded. Time stretched thin. She felt it, that old calm settling into her chest like a familiar friend. It was the same feeling she'd known in Syria, when the walls of a building collapsed around her team and her rifle had jammed. The moment when fear turns into something sharper, colder, where thought disappears and only instinct remains. But that was years ago. Here she wasn't fighting insurgents or ambushes. She was surrounded by her own Marines and soldiers, brothers in arms, though at this moment it didn't feel like it. It felt like high school all over again, like standing in another gym, different time, same laughter. She remembered Detroit. Foster homes that smelled like cigarette smoke and disappointment. Rooms that changed every few months, new walls, new faces, same threats. She learned early that being small meant being a target. By 14, she'd been in enough fights to understand leverage, angles, and pain, not the kind from a broken bone, but from humiliation, from fear. She learned to use that fear as fuel. Her last foster home had been the worst. A man who thought no one would believe her if she spoke, but she didn't need words. She needed timing. One kitchen table, one moment, one decision, and the man was on the floor surrounded by broken glass. The judge called it excessive force. The state called it a problem child. The army called it potential. At 17, she'd taken the deal. Jail or enlistment. She chose a uniform. And somehow the discipline, the chaos, the structure, it made sense to her. She excelled not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because the army was the first place that gave her a clear rule: fight, win, survive. She learned to march, to shoot, to push her limits until pain became just another form of silence. When she earned her Ranger tab, the applause didn't matter. What mattered was the look on her instructor's face when he said, "You don't quit, do you?" She didn't answer, because she didn't know how to quit anything. Now, as Tors called her to the center of the mat, that same silence filled her again. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked, smiling. It wasn't a question. It was a warning dressed as courtesy. Around them, a circle formed. Marines leaned forward, eager, ready for a show. Hawthorne's bare feet sank slightly into the mat. Her heartbeat slowed again. She didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't even shift her weight. "I'm ready," she said simply. The sound of her voice, calm, level, unbothered, made something flicker in Tor's expression. He turned to the general, waiting for the nod. But the general didn't nod. He stepped down from the platform and walked to the mat himself. "Staff Sergeant Tors," he said, his voice steady. "Let's make this demonstration meaningful. You and your 4 best instructors against Sergeant Hawthorne. Controlled engagement. First to submission or inability to continue." The room went dead quiet. Tors blinked. "Sir, that's not." Mitchell cut him off. "I've reviewed her record. She's cleared. Medics on standby. Or are your Marines afraid of a supply sergeant?" The laughter that followed was uneasy this time, forced, uncertain. Hawthorne's jaw tightened slightly. She hadn't asked for this. She didn't want to humiliate anyone. But there was something about moments like this, something she couldn't walk away from. Maybe it was pride. Maybe something older, deeper. The need to stop being the one underestimated. The need to teach a lesson that might save someone's life later if they listened. The Marines circled up, 4 men, each taller, heavier, stronger. She measured them with her eyes: stance, balance, distance, weight distribution. The first one was right dominant. The second relied on brute strength. The third was a grappler. The fourth was slow to react. She didn't need to know their names. She already knew their rhythm. The general stepped back. "Begin." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then motion exploded. The first Marine lunged, his hand reaching for a collar tie-up, textbook perfect. She shifted, not backward but through him, moving like water. 1 second she was in front of him, the next she was behind, guiding his weight into the man beside him. 2 bodies collided. Her knee struck the nerve just above the thigh, precise, brutal, controlled. The Marine's leg gave out like a switch had been flipped. Another swing, she ducked under, trapped an arm, twisted. The pop echoed, followed by a grunt. She released before damage, controlled, clean. A third Marine rushed from behind, too close, too committed. She dropped low, sprawled, caught him mid-motion. A choke, a strike, a sweep. Down. The last one hesitated, the worst mistake of all. She didn't. 15 seconds. That was all it took. Now the mat was silent except for the sound of breathing. The medics moved in, quick, calm. None of them were seriously hurt, just bruised, disoriented, and shocked by the speed of what had happened. Hawthorne stepped back, hands on her knees, breathing steady. Her hair, still tied in a tight bun, hadn't loosened a single strand. General Mitchell spoke again, his voice carrying across the room. "What you just saw is why we never underestimate an opponent by appearance. Discipline, control, and precision, that's combat. The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was respect, quiet, honest, earned the hard way. As Tors helped one of his Marines to his feet, he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. There was no mockery left, only humility. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "you've got to teach us that." She nodded once. "Happy to." But as the others started clearing the mat, laughing nervously, rubbing their bruises, Hawthorne's gaze drifted somewhere else. To the walls, to the shadows, to memory. Because the truth was, she hadn't fought them today. She fought every laugh, every sneer, every voice that ever told her she didn't belong. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, she'd won something that actually mattered. Still deep down, she knew this was only the surface. Because there was something she hadn't told anyone, not even the general. Something that still kept her up some nights. Something that made her hands tremble when the room was too quiet. And as the applause began to rise around her, she felt it, that ghost of a memory, whispering through the silence. Raqqa. The building. The blood. And the one voice she still couldn't forget. But she pushed it away, for now. Because this wasn't the time for ghosts. It was the time to teach. And to remind every Marine in that room, and maybe herself, that sometimes the smallest soldier in the fight carries the heaviest story. Why did her hands still tremble when no one was watching? That was the question she avoided every night. It wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was memory, and memory, she'd learned, was its own kind of enemy. The barracks at Camp Pendleton were quiet that evening. Outside, the Pacific wind carried the smell of salt and oil from the docks. Inside her small temporary room, Hawthorne sat on the lower bunk, still in her PT gear, her knuckles raw from training. She stared at them, at the faint lines of scar tissue that no lotion could erase. They looked like they'd been carved there with purpose, each one a story, each one a secret. Her reflection in the mirror across the room looked older than 31. The lines under her eyes, the slight tension in her jaw, they didn't come from age. They came from the things she carried, things she'd buried under layers of control and discipline. There was a knock at the door. "Sergeant." It was Staff Sergeant Tors, the last person she expected. When she opened the door, he stood there awkwardly, hands clasped behind his back, his voice softer than she'd heard it all day. "Didn't want to bother you," he said. "Just wanted to thank you for earlier. You made us all look at ourselves differently." She gave a polite nod. "It wasn't about that, Staff Sergeant." "Still," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I deserved it, we all did." He hesitated. "You know, I've been doing this a long time. MCMAP, combat training, close quarters stuff. Thought I'd seen it all, but what you did, that wasn't just technique, it was something else. Something cold, controlled, like you weren't even there." She looked at him, not unkindly, but with that calm stillness again. Maybe that's the only way to survive certain kinds of fights. He frowned slightly, trying to understand. She didn't elaborate. He didn't press. When he left, she closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. He wasn't wrong. Sometimes she wasn't really there. Sometimes, even now, she still heard the voices. It always started the same way, the sound of distant explosions, the rattle of gunfire, the radio static. Then came the breathing. Her own, shallow, fast, controlled only because she forced it to be. Raqqa 2017. The memory dragged her there without mercy. The room had been dark, blown open from the blast. Concrete dust in the air, thick enough to choke on. Her fire team was pinned in what used to be a 2-story apartment building. The mission had been simple, recon and extraction of intel from an abandoned enemy site. Simple, until it was. "Contact left, second floor." The voice of Specialist Rains had cracked through the radio, followed by a scream. Then silence. She could still see the way his body fell through the smoke, how it landed near her boots. She remembered kneeling beside him, pressing her hands into his vest, whispering that he'd be fine even though she could feel his heartbeat fade under her palms. She remembered the way time slowed after that. The M4 in her hands, the magazine clicking empty. The doorway ahead half collapsed, filled with movement, enemy silhouettes closing in. There were 3 of them. Maybe 4. Her team was gone. And she had seconds. She didn't remember deciding what to do. She just moved. Her body acted before her mind caught up, years of training taking over, automatic, merciless. Hand to hand. Close quarters. Every strike had been fast, brutal, efficient. She stopped thinking of them as people. They were obstacles between her and survival. When it was over, the silence was unbearable. 4 bodies on the ground. Her rifle on the floor beside them. And her hands shaking, soaked in blood that wasn't hers. Later, command called it exceptional valor in close quarters combat. They gave her a silver star. The paperwork said classified circumstances. The truth was simpler. She'd done what she had to do. But the price of survival was a kind of stillness that never went away. When the memory faded, she realized her fists were clenched again. Her knuckles were white. She forced herself to breathe, slow and deep, counting each exhale like a soldier counting down to calm. She sat down at the small desk and opened her notebook. Inside were names not of missions, not of battles, names of people she'd trained, soldiers, Marines, operators. Some she'd lost contact with, some she'd buried. Each name was a thread in the quiet tapestry of her career. She added a new one, Tors. The sound of the ocean outside her window filled the silence. For a long moment, she just listened. The rhythm of the waves was steady, like a heartbeat she could borrow when her own felt too heavy. The next morning came early. The Marines were already lined up at the mat before she arrived. The laughter was gone. The air was different, focused, attentive, respectful. Tors met her at the edge of the mat and handed her a clipboard. "Training roster, ma'am. We're ready when you are." She almost smiled at the ma'am. "Almost. Let's start with what you think you know," she said. The session began slow, drills, grapples, escapes. She didn't humiliate them. She corrected their stances, adjusted their grips, explained the difference between technique and violence. "Fighting isn't about strength," she said. "It's about control, control of the body, control of the mind, and sometimes control of the fear." They listened, really listened. Halfway through, one Marine asked, "Ma'am, have you ever been scared?" The question hung there, the kind that made the room feel smaller. She paused for a moment, staring at the mat, as if considering how much truth they could handle. "Yes," she said finally, "more times than I can count, but fear isn't the enemy, complacency is." "Complacency," Tors echoed. She nodded. "When you stop respecting what fear can teach you, that's when you make mistakes. Fear sharpens you, but it only helps if you listen." She demonstrated a disarm next, a variation most hadn't seen before. She moved slow enough for them to watch the sequence. Redirect, trap, strike, neutralize. "See that?" she said. "That's how you survive when the other person's bigger, faster, stronger. You use their size against them." When the session ended, Tors looked different, not just respectful, reflective. "You ever think about writing a manual for this?" he asked. She shrugged. "Manuals don't save people, training does." That night she walked down to the shoreline behind the base. The ocean stretched wide and endless, black under the moonlight. She stood barefoot in the sand, letting the waves crawl over her feet. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think, really think, about what it all meant. All the years of training, the deployments, the medals, the moments that blurred between violence and silence. And still, what echoed most wasn't the sound of gunfire. It was laughter. That same mocking laughter that had followed her since she was 14. Maybe that was why she never stopped training, why she never stayed anywhere long enough to get comfortable. Because comfort meant vulnerability. And vulnerability, she'd learned, was the first thing you lost when you survived too much. She picked up a smooth rock from the sand and turned it in her fingers. In the distance, the faint lights of the pier shimmered. Somewhere out there, other soldiers and Marines were unwinding from the day, laughing, drinking, forgetting. She envied that, the ability to forget. But forgetting was a luxury she didn't have. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the sand. It was General Mitchell. He stood beside her without speaking for a while. The waves filled the silence between them. Finally, he said, "You've got a reputation now," words spreading fast. She didn't answer. "They're calling you the ghost instructor," he added with a faint smile. "Said you dropped 4 Marines in 15 seconds. She exhaled softly through her nose. "That's not something to be proud of." "No," he said, "it's something to learn from." He turned to her. "You ever think about coming back to the Warfare Center, help develop advanced combatives for smaller operators?" She looked out at the ocean. "I thought I was done with that part of my life." "Maybe that part isn't done with you," he said. His words lingered. After he left, she stayed there a while longer, watching the water fold and unfold. She didn't know it yet, but the decision she'd make in the coming days to return to teach, to face what she'd been running from, would change everything. For now, though, she just stood there, letting the tide erase her footprints. Because sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let the past wash over you, until it stops hurting to remember. Why did she hesitate at the gate? She passed through hundreds before dusty checkpoints in the Middle East, windswept outposts in Eastern Europe, jungle camps that never officially existed. But this one at Fort Liberty felt different. Maybe because it wasn't a battlefield. It was home, or at least it used to be. The guard checked her ID, gave a small nod and waved her through. The metal arm lifted, slow and deliberate. It reminded her of all the things in her life that took longer than they should have: healing, forgiveness, silence. Her new orders had come 2 weeks after Camp Pendleton. Return to Fort Liberty. Report to the Special Warfare Center. Temporary duty. Advanced Combatives Development Program. The title sounded neat, bureaucratic, safe, but nothing about coming back here was safe. Not for her. The road into the base cut through long stretches of pine. Early morning mist hung low, catching the orange of sunrise. She drove with the windows down, letting the cold air sting her face. It helped her stay awake and grounded. Every few minutes she glanced at her rearview mirror. Habit, old habits die slow. When she reached the training compound, a group of soldiers were already lined up in the yard. Young, sharp, restless. Their laughter reminded her of the Marines at Pendleton. Maybe it was universal, the laughter before humility. As she stepped out of her truck, a voice called out, "Ma'am, welcome back to Liberty." Captain Daniel Reyes, her former trainee, now in charge of the combatives cadre. He was taller than she remembered, hair shorter, but the same calm eyes. "Captain," she greeted. "Never thought I'd see you back here," he said, smiling. "Neither did I." They shook hands, and for a brief moment, something like warmth passed between them. Mutual respect, shared understanding. Then professionalism returned. "You've got a full roster," he said, handing her a tablet. "Operators from SOCOM, some Rangers, a few Marine liaisons. Word about Pendleton spread faster than wildfire. Everyone wants to train under the Ghost." She sighed. "That's not a name I chose." Reyes chuckled. "No one ever does." By noon, the training floor was filled with motion, mats, shouts, controlled chaos. Hawthorne stood at the center, calm as stone, watching her students spar. She corrected posture, interrupted sloppy strikes, reset their rhythm with soft-spoken precision. "Slow down," she said to one soldier. You're thinking too loud. Violence doesn't care about choreography. It's not about looking good. It's about ending what starts. Her students listened. They moved differently after that. But even as she taught, her focus flickered. Her mind kept drifting back to Raka. Back to that room. Back to the fourth man. She never told anyone about the fourth. The official report said there were 4 hostiles. She neutralized them all. But there was something the report didn't mention, the one who hadn't died, the one she'd let live. It happened in seconds. He dropped his weapon, raised his hands. She should have finished it, protocol said so, but she'd seen his face, young, terrified, barely more than 20, and in that moment she couldn't do it. She disarmed him, kicked the rifle away, and left him alive. A week later, their convoy hit an IED. She was one of only 2 who made it out. And intelligence later confirmed the cell responsible for that IED attack was led by a man matching the description of the one she'd spared. She carried that knowledge for years, quietly, alone. The silver star on her chest felt heavier because of it. And every time someone called her a hero, a part of her wanted to disappear. Now, watching her new recruits struggle and sweat, she wondered how many of them would survive their own mistakes and how many wouldn't. When the session ended, Reyes approached her with a tablet. "Intel Division's been asking for you," he said. Her eyes narrowed. "For me?" He nodded. "They're forming a joint training advisory team for an upcoming rotation overseas. Low profile, but they specifically requested an SOCP-qualified instructor with deployment experience." She looked away, exhaling slowly. "You mean Syria?" He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Because they want someone who's seen what the manuals don't teach." He studied her face for a moment. "You okay with that?" She didn't respond right away. Her eyes drifted toward the window, to the flagpole outside swaying against the wind. "Okay," she said quietly. That night after the lights went out, she sat in the empty gym. The mats were still warm from the day's training. The faint smell of sweat and chalk lingered. She sat cross-legged in the center, her shadow stretching long across the floor. For the first time in a long time, she spoke out loud, not to anyone, not even to herself, but to the silence. "I should have finished it," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, breaking the still air. The silence didn't answer. She dropped her head into her hands, fingers pressing into her temples. The tears didn't come, they never did, but the ache was there, deep and raw. Behind her the door creaked open, footsteps. "Couldn't sleep either." "Raise again." He sat beside her, without invitation. They sat in silence for a while, just the hum of the fluorescent light above them. Then he said, "You ever wonder why people like us keep doing this? Training, teaching, going back." She looked up, eyes tired. "Because if we stop, we'll have to feel it." He nodded. "Yeah, that sounds about right." She studied him for a moment, this younger officer who still had hope in his eyes, the kind she'd lost somewhere between deployments. "Don't lose that," she said softly. "Lose what?" "That thing that makes you human. The Army'll take it if you let it." He smiled faintly. "I think it already did." The next day, during combatives evaluation, one of the trainees, a young corporal, pushed too hard, tried to prove something. He charged at Hawthorne during a demonstration, off-script, fast and reckless. She reacted on instinct, stepped aside, redirected, swept him hard to the mat. The impact echoed. He didn't get up right away. Medics rushed in. The corporal was fine, just winded, but the look on Hawthorne's face froze everyone. For a second her eyes had gone cold again. Not angry, not scared, just distant. Like she was somewhere else entirely. After the incident, she excused herself, walked out of the building. Reyes found her sitting on the steps outside, staring at her hands again. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," she said, but her voice didn't sound convincing. He didn't push, he just sat beside her. The breeze rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, Caden's chants echoed from a platoon on morning run. "I think about it every day," she said finally. "About what?" "That mission, Raqqa, the one no one talks about. There was one I didn't kill, and he came back, took people from my unit." Her voice trembled for the first time. "They call it restraint, I call it a mistake." Reyes didn't interrupt. She turned to him. "You ever feel like the world keeps testing you on lessons you already failed?" He nodded slowly. "All the time." She looked out toward the training field. "I'm not sure I'm teaching them the right things anymore." "You're teaching them how to live," he said. "That's more than most ever get." For a long while, neither of them spoke. When the sun began to rise, the light cut across her face, soft, pale red gold. For a moment it made her look younger, almost peaceful. Later that week, the official memo came through. She was to lead an advanced combatives detachment overseas. Temporary assignment. Duration, classified. Attached unit, Joint Special Operations Advisory Group. As she read the orders, she caught her reflection in the glass of the office window, the same calm expression, the same still eyes. But beneath it she saw something else. Not fear, not excitement. Resolution. Before she left, she went to the training floor one last time. Her students stood at attention, waiting for words of wisdom. She hated speeches. So she kept it simple. "Don't fight to prove something," she said. "Fight to protect something. It's not about pride, it's about purpose. The day you forget that, you lose." Reyes saluted her as she walked out. "Come back in one piece, Ghost." She smirked. "No promises." Outside, the wind caught her hair as she stepped into the transport vehicle. The engine roared to life. She didn't look back. Because some returns aren't about coming home. They're about finishing what started years ago. And deep down, she knew this mission wasn't about teaching. It was about closure. How many times can someone return to the same place before it breaks them? That question whispered in her mind as the C-130 touched down on the tarmac outside Erbil. The hum of the engines faded into the hot desert air, but the noise inside her chest didn't stop. It never did. Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne stepped off the ramp, boots hitting the ground she swore she'd never see again. The air was thick with heat, dust, and the faint metallic scent of old conflict. She squinted against the sun, that same merciless light she remembered from Syria, the one that never softened, never forgave. Around her, soldiers unloaded gear, checked weapons, cracked jokes, business as usual. To them, this was another rotation, another patch of desert with a different name. To her, it was the past made real again. A special operations transport picked her up from the airfield, unmarked, efficient, forgettable. Inside sat two men in tan uniforms, both wearing beards and quiet eyes that told her they weren't here for conversation. She sat opposite them, hands on her knees, watching the landscape roll by through the armored glass. The compound appeared after an hour, a small joint base outside a nameless village. A mix of U.S. and local coalition flags waved lazily in the heat. She could smell the diesel from generators, the sweat of soldiers who hadn't slept, the faint scent of burnt coffee coming from the mess tent. It all felt too familiar. As she stepped out, a voice called, "Sergeant Hawthorne." A man in civilian clothes approached, salt and pepper beard, sunglasses, posture too disciplined for a contractor. CIA, she guessed immediately. "Name, Dalton," he said. "You're here to help train our liaison teams. We've been working with local defense units, mostly former militia turned cooperative forces. Your job, to keep them alive when things go sideways." "Understood," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "You've been here before." Her eyes flicked toward the distant hills, toward the ghost of a city that once burned. "A long time ago." Dalton nodded slowly. Then you already know what happens when people underestimate the quiet ones. For the next week, she trained soldiers and locals side by side. The days were long drills, tactics, field movements. She spoke little, demonstrated more. She corrected technique without anger, with a precision that made even the most stubborn fighters listen. They respected her, not because of rank, but because she moved like someone who understood violence in its purest form, not as theory, but as memory. One afternoon, after a session on defensive extractions, a local translator named Amir approached her. He was young, polite, barely 25. "Sergeant," he said, his accent soft, "you teach like someone who has seen this before." She smiled faintly. "I've seen a lot of things before." He hesitated, then added, "I heard you were in Raqqa, back then." Her heart stuttered once, barely noticeable, but enough for her to feel it. "Who told you that?" "Everyone talks," he said simply. "That's where you became the ghost, yes." She almost laughed at the word, but there was no humor in it. Ghosts don't come back. Amir studied her. Maybe they do, when they have unfinished things. That night she couldn't sleep. The desert outside was too quiet, too still. She sat on her cot, staring at the wall. The air smelled of sand and machine oil. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps she'd once heard in the dark. She reached into her duffel and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the mission citation from Raqqa. The words were printed in formal language, sterile, official. Exceptional valor, close quarters engagement, enemy neutralized. She read those words again and again, and every time she did, her chest tightened. Because one of them hadn't been neutralized. 2 days later, Dalton summoned her to the command tent. Inside, a projection map glowed blue against the beige canvas walls. "Intel update," he said. "There's been chatter from remnants of an old cell operating near Tel Abyad. We believe one of the local militia leaders we've been working with may have ties to that network." He tapped the map. "Name, Khalid Faris, ex-combatant, claims to have turned. Says he wants to help stabilize the region, but something doesn't add up." The name hit her like static in her skull. Khalid Faris. The same name from the old after-action report. The man who'd led the ambush. The one she'd spared. Her hand tightened around the edge of the table. "You said he's helping us now." "Supposedly," Dalton said. "We're meeting him tomorrow to verify his cooperation. I want you there. You read people better than most." She nodded, masking the tension in her throat. "Understood." When she stepped outside, the sun had begun to set, a blood-orange horizon melting into shadow. She stood there for a long time, watching the desert swallow the light. That night she didn't dream, she remembered. The fourth man's eyes, the way he dropped his weapon, the fear on his face. And now the idea that he might still be alive, walking under the same sky. She didn't know if she was ready to face that. But maybe that was the point. The next day they drove in a small convoy, 2 vehicles, 4 soldiers, 1 translator. The landscape was endless and empty, a pale sea of dust and wind. After an hour they reached a small village at the base of a rocky ridge. Children ran barefoot between houses made of cracked mud brick. Women carried water in plastic jugs. It looked peaceful, but she'd learned long ago peace was often just the space between storms. Dalton motioned toward a shaded tent near the edge of the village. "He's inside." As she stepped closer, she could feel her pulse start to rise. She'd faced gunfire, ambushes, explosions, but nothing made her heart race like unfinished business. Inside, the air was cooler. 2 men sat on low stools. One was Amir, translating. The other was older than she remembered, with silver in his beard, but the eyes, those eyes, she knew them. Khalid Faris stood when he saw her. Surprise flashed across his face. Recognition. He said something in Arabic, too quiet for the others to catch. Amir translated. He says, "You are the woman from the building." Her throat tightened. "Yes." He looked down for a moment, then back up. You spared me. Dalton glanced between them, sensing the tension but not understanding it. You two know each other. She hesitated. We crossed paths before. Forrest nodded slowly. More than paths, Sergeant. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between them felt heavy, fragile. Finally, Forrest said, "That day you could have killed me. I saw death in your eyes, and yet you didn't. I remember wondering why." She exhaled through her nose. I ask myself the same question every day. He stepped closer, not in challenge, but with quiet gravity. You think I became the man who planted that bomb. You are wrong. I left that cell after you spared me, but others didn't believe in mercy. They saw it as weakness. I tried to stop them. I failed. His voice wavered. I lost family because of that. I lost everything. She stared at him, searching for deceit, but there was none. Only truth, worn and scarred like her own. Dalton broke the silence. So you're saying you're clean now? Forrest met his gaze. No one who has killed is ever clean, but I am not your enemy. They left the meeting cautiously, with new intel but even heavier hearts. As they drove back, Dalton said, "He's either the best liar I've ever met or the most honest man in this desert." Hawthorne stared out the window. Sometimes they're the same thing. That night she walked alone beyond the compound perimeter, past the outer lights, until the stars opened above her, clear, infinite, cold. She thought about what Forrest said. About mercy, about failure. About what it means to live after surviving what should have killed you. For years, she'd believed her mercy had caused death. But maybe, just maybe, mercy was the only thing that had kept her human. Her radio crackled softly, Dalton's voice. "Hawthorne, we've got movement near the East Ridge. Might be nothing, but stay sharp." "Copy that," she said. She raised her night vision goggles, scanning the ridgeline, and froze. 3 heat signatures, moving low and fast. 2 coordinated for civilians. "Dalton," she said quietly, "we've got company." The desert wind picked up. The night turned electric. And somewhere out there, in the shadows of the place where her ghost still walked, she realized the past wasn't finished with her yet. Why did silence always come before the storm? It was the same in every fight, every ambush, every memory that refused to fade. That moment when the world seemed to hold its breath and then exhale violence. Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne crouched beside a sandbag wall on the east perimeter of the compound. The night air was sharp and still, the desert stretching wide under a sky powdered with stars. Through her NVGs, she could see 3 silhouettes moving along the ridge, deliberate, coordinated, patient. Not scavengers, not villagers, fighters. She keyed her radio. "Dalton, it's real, 3, maybe 4, moving south by east, closing in fast." Static answered for a heartbeat, then his voice. "Confirmed, QRF mobilizing. You've got 2 minutes." 2 minutes. Not enough to think, just enough to act. She slung her rifle up, exhaled once, and moved. Her boots sank into the sand with soft, controlled rhythm. The compound lights behind her glowed faintly, distant and dim. She didn't need them. She knew this terrain, these shadows. The desert was a ghost she'd already learned to walk with. The first gunfire broke the stillness. Short, sharp bursts. A flare cracked overhead, bathing everything in a sickly red light. The ridge erupted. "Contact East Ridge." Voices shouted over the radio. Rounds tore into the sandbags, spraying grit and dust. Hawthorne dropped behind a crate, scanned movement near the rocks. 1, 2, 3 muzzle flashes. She lined up the shot, fired twice. 1 silhouette fell, the other 2 scattered. Her pulse didn't spike. Her breathing stayed even. Combat had a rhythm, and hers was steady as a metronome. She switched positions, crawling to a better vantage point. Somewhere behind her, the siren wailed, a rising note of alarm. The base was waking up. She spotted the next fighter near the ridge kneeling, trying to reload. Her scope centered, breath in, half release. Then the figure jerked and went still. A voice behind her broke through the noise. Contact right. It was Amir, the translator, clutching an M4 awkwardly, his first real firefight. She motioned for him to stay low. Keep your head down. Then she saw it, the third one, flanking, moving toward the fuel drums near the generator, the glint of a detonator in his hand. No time for thought, she sprinted forward. The shot came, grazing her arm, burning through fabric and skin. She didn't stop. Her shoulder slammed into him, driving both of them to the ground. The detonator flew into the sand. She wrestled, the world collapsing into noise and dust. He swung wildly, she ducked, trapped his arm, drove her elbow into his throat. He gagged, kicked, tried to reach his belt, a knife glinting, but she twisted, used his own momentum, and the blade fell harmlessly into the dark. When it was over, he was gasping under her knee, disarmed and alive. Her rifle was an arm's length away. She could end it now. One pull. One breath. Her hand trembled. For a split second, she wasn't in the desert anymore. She was back in that ruined building in Raqqa. The same position, the same look in the enemy's eyes, the same mercy that had haunted her for years. She froze, torn between two ghosts. Then a voice called out from behind, "Sergeant." It was Dalton, running up with two soldiers. He saw her kneeling over the man, weapon in hand. "You good?" She nodded, breath steadying. "He's secure." Dalton crouched beside her, scanning the scene. "That him?" She looked down at the prisoner. His face was covered in sand and blood, but his voice, when he spoke, was low and broken. He said my name." Dalton frowned. "What?" She leaned closer. The man coughed, looked up through cracked lips, and whispered, "Faris sent me." Her pulse stopped cold. "Faris," she repeated. The man nodded weakly. "He said, if you are here, tell you he kept his promise." Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp. They dragged him to the medical tent, but he was gone before dawn. The report labeled it, "Failed infiltration by unknown hostiles." But to Hawthorne, it was a message. Faris wasn't behind the attack. He'd warned her. By sunrise, the desert looked almost peaceful again. The smoke had settled. The compound buzzed with repair crews and medics. The bodies were already being wrapped. Dalton handed her a cup of black coffee. "You did good," he said quietly. She didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the ridgeline shimmered with heat. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That someone out there still knows how to reach me." He gave a small nod. "You think it's this Faris guy?" "I know it is." "What do you want to do about it?" She took a long sip, the bitter taste grounding her. "Find him." Dalton studied her face, calm, focused, unreadable. "You sure that's about the mission and not about you?" She looked at him. "At this point, I'm not sure there's a difference." That afternoon, she and Amir drove out toward the ridge in a single Humvee. No backup, just maps, radios, and instinct. The road disappeared quickly into open sand. Amir kept glancing at her, uneasy. "You trust him, this Faris?" She didn't answer right away. "I don't trust anyone," she said finally, "but I owe him the truth." The ridge loomed ahead, jagged and ancient. They stopped near a cluster of boulders where the rock met the sky. He was waiting there. Khalid Faris, unarmed, alone. Hawthorne stepped out slowly, rifle lowered but ready. Faris raised his hands. "No weapons. I came because you deserve to know." Her voice was steady. "You sent them." He shook his head. "They weren't mine. They were from the same group I once belonged to. They knew I'd met with you. They wanted to prove I'd betrayed them." He hesitated. "That's why I warned you." She studied his face. The lines were deeper, the eyes still sharp. He wasn't lying. "Why help us?" she asked. "Because mercy changes people," he he said softly. You showed me that once. I tried to be the man you believed I could be, but some ghosts don't forgive redemption. The wind gusted, carrying the smell of dust and old smoke. He looked out toward the dunes. I didn't plant that bomb, Sergeant, but I carried the guilt as if I did. Because when you let me live, I promised myself I'd never take another life unless it meant saving one. He turned to her. You saved me, let me return it. Before she could speak, a distant crack split the air. A rifle shot. Forrest staggered, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. Sniper, she shouted, diving for cover, dragging him behind the rocks. Amir hit the dirt, panicked, fumbling for his radio. Base, this is Hawthorne, we're under fire. East Ridge, one down, requesting medevac. Forrest coughed, blood on his lips. No time, he gasped. They followed me, they don't want peace, they want revenge. She pressed her hand to the wound, firm, desperate. Stay with me. He smiled weakly. You still fight like you did that night. The second shot missed by inches, hitting the stone beside her head. She looked up, scanned the ridge there. A glint of glass, the shooter repositioning. She rolled, aimed, fired 3 rounds. Silence, then stillness. When she looked back, Forrest was fading fast. He gripped her wrist with surprising strength. Do not hate yourself, he whispered. We both lived because you chose not to kill. His eyes drifted upward, unfocused, fixed on something she couldn't see. Then they went still. She sat there for a long time, the desert wind wrapping around them like a shroud. The mission report would later say engagement with hostile sniper, another nameless casualty. But to her, it wasn't nameless. It was the closing of a circle she never wanted to draw. When the medevac finally arrived, Dalton found her still sitting beside the body, covered in dust, silent. He crouched beside her. You okay? She didn't answer. Her eyes were distant, locked on the horizon. Later, back at the base, she washed her hands in the sink. The water ran pink, then clear, then pink again. She stared at her reflection, same face, same eyes, same quiet calm. But something inside her had shifted. Not lighter, not heavier, just realigned. Amir found her outside the barracks. He looked lost, like someone trying to make sense of a story that didn't fit any logic. Why did you come out here, Sergeant? He asked quietly. She looked up at the stars, to understand what mercy costs. And did you? She nodded. Everything, but it's still worth paying for. He didn't know what to say, neither did she. When the wind moved through the camp that night, it carried the faint scent of sand and memory. Somewhere, far beyond that ridge, the ghosts of her past finally stopped whispering. But as she sat alone, cleaning her rifle under the dim tent light, she realized something else. She'd been wrong about the meaning of survival. It wasn't about who lived. It was about how you lived afterward. And for the first time in years, she felt a strange kind of peace. Not loud, not triumphant, just quiet, like the desert before dawn. How long does peace last before it starts to feel like guilt again? That thought came to her the first night she heard rain instead of gunfire. Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne was back in the States, back at Fort Liberty. Her return was unceremonious, a handshake, a debriefing, and a stack of non-disclosure papers. No parade, no applause. She preferred it that way. Heroes, she'd learned, rarely slept well. The base looked the same. Same pine trees leaning over the fences. Same buzz of helicopters in the distance. But everything felt different, as if the color had drained out of the world. She walked past young soldiers laughing outside the Chow Hall and wondered if they'd ever look at the sand the same way once they'd been there. In her duffel was the only thing she'd brought back from the desert, Forrest's prayer bead bracelet, cracked and faded. She kept it in a small cloth pouch, away from the medals and certificates she no longer cared to display. The morning after her arrival, Captain Reyes met her in the training hall. Word is you wrapped things up overseas, he said carefully. Something like that. You look different. I am. He hesitated. Command wants you to restart the Advanced Combatives course. They want to expand it to inter-branch personnel. Apparently, the Marines can't stop talking about you. She gave a faint smile. You volunteering. Already signed up. So she stayed. The first day back on the mat, she felt the old rhythm return, movements clean, controlled, precise. But her tone was softer now. She spoke less about domination and more about restraint. When you learn to fight, she told them, you learn the power to destroy, but that's not mastery. Mastery is knowing when not to. Her students listened, even the ones who'd come expecting some legend of violence. They left each day quieter than they'd arrived. During breaks, she'd find herself watching them spar, young, loud, unscarred, and she'd remember what it felt like to believe the world was simple. Good versus bad, win or lose, live or die. But the truth sat heavier now in the silence between drills. One afternoon after class dismissed, Reyes lingered. You never told me what really happened out there, he said. She wiped sweat from her face, dropped the towel on the mat. You wouldn't believe me if I did. Try me. She paused. I met him, the man I spared. His eyes widened, and he wasn't what I thought. None of them were. Turns out Mercy's complicated. Reyes studied her, and the ones who attacked the base. She shook her head. Same men, different ghosts. He didn't press. Maybe he knew that some stories lose their meaning when explained. That evening she walked alone to the memorial garden on base, the small one near the chapel, lined with bricks engraved with names. She traced her finger over the ones from her unit. Rains, Cooper, Marks, names carved into stone because she had lived and they hadn't. She knelt, the gravel cold under her knees, and whispered, I kept the promise. The wind rustled the flags. Somewhere, a bell rang from the chapel tower. Weeks passed. Routine returned. The ghosts didn't disappear, but they grew quieter. Sometimes she caught herself laughing again, softly, like testing the sound of it after years of forgetting how. One evening she stood outside the training building, watching the sunset. Reyes joined her, coffee in hand. You ever think about getting out? He asked. All the time. What keeps you here? She thought about it. Maybe this is how I pay my debt. Debt? For surviving. He nodded slowly. You ever gonna forgive yourself? She smiled faintly, working on it. That night she dreamed again. Only this time it wasn't the ambush or the screams. It was the sound of the desert wind and Faris's voice saying, Mercy changes people. She woke up before dawn, the room dim and quiet. For the first time the memory didn't hurt. It just existed. At sunrise she walked to the mat alone. No students, no noise, just her and the echo of her footsteps. She bowed slightly before stepping on out of habit, then began moving through drills she hadn't practiced in years. Slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Each strike flowed into the next, not as aggression but as release. When Reyes entered later, he stopped in the doorway and watched. She moved like a shadow in rhythm with her own heartbeat. You praying or fighting? He asked when she finally noticed him. Maybe both, she said. He handed her an envelope. Command wants a paper on the ethics of close quarters engagement, training manual update. She raised an eyebrow. Ethics? Yeah, they said you'd know what to write. That night she sat at the desk in her quarters, the same desk she'd used years before. She turned on the small lamp, pulled a fresh page, and began to write. Combat isn't about killing. It's about choosing not to when you could. Violence is simple. Restraint is art. The world will call you soft for hesitating, weak for showing mercy. But sometimes the strongest thing a soldier can do is lay down the weapon and face what's left inside. She stopped, pen hovering. For a long time she just stared at the words, then added one last line. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. When she finished, she folded the page and slipped it into the envelope. She didn't sign it. The words didn't need a name. In the following weeks, whispers spread through the training community about the Hawthorne Doctrine, a new teaching emphasis on restraint and psychological readiness. It wasn't official doctrine, not really, but it changed the tone of training halls across bases. Soldiers began talking more about control than aggression, about empathy and chaos. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Reyes once joked, "You realize you're rewriting the fight book." She shrugged, "Maybe I'm just finishing the part we always skipped." Months later, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph, grainy, old, clearly taken long before the war. It showed a young boy standing beside an older man on a dusty street. On the back, written in neat Arabic script, were the words, "Your mercy reached farther than you knew." She didn't need to guess who it was from. She framed the picture, placed it on her shelf beside a single brass casing she'd kept from Raqqa. Every night before turning off the light, she looked at them both, the casing and the photo, opposites sharing the same space. Violence and grace, cause and consequence. She'd never reconcile them, but maybe that was the point. One morning, during PT formation, a new private whispered loud enough for her to hear, "That's her, the one who dropped 4 Marines." The line spread through the ranks, a ripple of awe and disbelief. She pretended not to notice, but inside it almost made her laugh, if they only knew the rest of it. After dismissal, she caught the private on his way out. "You know what really happened that day?" she asked. He shook his head, nervous. "I stopped fighting the moment it was over," she said. "That's the part they never tell." He nodded, not understanding yet, but maybe one day he would. That evening the sun dipped behind the training field, turning everything gold. Hawthorne walked the perimeter slowly, hands in her pockets, the faint hum of insects filling the quiet. She thought about all the laughter that had once followed her, the disbelief, the stares. And she smiled, not out of pride but peace. She wasn't the ghost anymore. She was just Ben Hawthorne, soldier, teacher, survivor. A woman who had learned that strength wasn't the absence of fear or pain, but the courage to stand inside both and stay gentle anyway. The wind picked up, brushing against the flags near the range. Somewhere a cadence echoed faintly, young voices shouting in rhythm, alive, unaware of the history beneath their boots. She stopped, listening, then whispered to the air, "Keep them safe." The breeze carried her words away, and for once she let it. When she turned back toward the training hall, the last light of day stretched her shadow long across the ground, steady, unbroken, still moving forward. Because survival, she finally understood, isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of learning how to live again. And as the door closed behind her, the mat waiting under the dim fluorescent light, she breathed in deeply, calm, centered, whole, ready to teach the next generation what the battlefield never could. Sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that leave no sound at all. How do you measure the worth of what you've survived? That question stayed with her long after the nightmares faded, not as pain anymore, but as curiosity. Maybe the answer lived in what came after. It was spring at Fort Liberty, the air damp with Carolina rain. The training mats smelled of disinfectant and wet canvas. Hawthorne stood at the edge of the floor, clipboard in hand, watching the new intakes stumble through their first drills. They were nervous, eager, full of energy she remembered but no longer needed. Reyes was beside her. "Fresh batch," he said. "Half of them think they're auditioning for a movie." "They'll learn," she replied. Then she saw her, a small woman in the second row, maybe 22, hair braided tight, stance too defensive, eyes too sharp for a beginner. There was something familiar in the way she scanned the room, not afraid, just calculating exits. Hawthorne knew that look. She'd worn it once. After the session, she called her over. "Name?" "Private Lena Moore, ma'am." "Where you from, Moore?" "Detroit, ma'am." That single word made Hawthorne's chest tighten. Detroit. The city she'd spent her childhood running through trying to survive. The ghosts of foster homes, alleyways, and courtrooms lived there. "What made you join?" she asked. Moore hesitated. "Judge gave me a choice." Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Good choice." Over the next weeks, Moore stood out. Quick learner, smart, too quiet. Hawthorne saw flashes of herself in the girl, anger tucked beneath discipline, a restlessness that looked like determination but felt like pain. During one late evening session, after the others had gone, Moore lingered on the mat. "You ever get tired of pretending you're okay?" she asked suddenly. Hawthorne looked up from coiling the mats. "All the time." "So what do you do?" "I stop pretending." Moore gave a small laugh, the kind that hides tears. "Does it ever go away, the stuff you see?" "No," Hawthorne said softly, "but it gets quieter." They trained in silence after that, 2 generations of the same story moving through drills that felt more like therapy than combat. Each block, each fall, each recovery was a sentence in a conversation words couldn't carry. As months passed, Moore's progress was undeniable. She won matches, mentored others, and carried herself with a steadiness that came straight from Hawthorne's example. Rumors started again. The new ghost. Hawthorne shut that down immediately. "She's not a ghost," she told the cadre. "She's proof the living still matter." One afternoon, Reyes pulled Hawthorne aside. "Command wants you to nominate an NCO for the Joint Exchange Program next quarter. You thinking about Moore?" "Yeah," Hawthorne said, "but she's not ready." "She will be," he replied. "You made sure of it." That night Hawthorne walked the empty halls of the training center. Photos lined the walls, teams, graduates, fallen soldiers. In one frame she saw her younger self, standing stiffly between 2 instructors. She barely recognized the girl. There was steel in that stare but no peace. She turned off the lights and stood in the dark for a long time, listening to the hum of the building. Teaching hadn't erased the past, but it had given it shape. Every lesson she taught was a way of rewriting what once broke her. Weeks later, Moore knocked on her office door. "Permission to speak freely." "Always." "They offered me the exchange slot," Moore said. "And I'm scared." "Good," Hawthorne said. "That means you understand what it costs." Moore sat down. "They keep saying I remind them of you, but I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It is," Hawthorne said. "And it is. You don't need to be me. You just need to survive differently." She reached into her drawer and took out the small cloth pouch. Inside was the cracked bracelet, the one Faris had worn. She placed it on the desk. "Take it." Moore frowned. "Ma'am." "It belonged to someone I spared. Someone who taught me that mercy isn't weakness. Keep it with you. Remember that you can win a fight without losing yourself." Moore held it carefully as if it were fragile. "Why give it to me?" "Because stories don't end when we survive. They keep moving through whoever listens." That night after Moore left, Hawthorne sat in the quiet office and felt the weight lift. Not gone, just finally shareable. Spring turned to summer. The new class graduated. During the ceremony, Reyes handed out certificates while Hawthorne stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes scanning the crowd. When Moore's name was called, she stepped forward with the poise of someone who finally believed she belonged. Afterward, Moore found her. "Heading out next week," she said. Hawthorne smiled. "You'll do fine." "I'm not sure I can live up to your legend." "Don't," Hawthorne said. "Write your own." They shook hands, then embraced, a brief, wordless exchange that said more than any salute. When Moore left, the training hall felt empty again. But it wasn't the emptiness of loss. It was the space left behind when something heavy finally sets down. Later that evening, Reyes found her sitting on the bleachers, watching the last light fade through the open doors. "You know," he said, "for someone who doesn't like speeches, you've started a movement." She smirked. "Movements start by accident. I just taught them to listen." "To what?" The silence between punches. He laughed quietly. So what now, Hawthorne? She looked out at the mats, smooth and waiting. Maybe I stop fighting for once. Maybe I just live. Rays nodded. You earned that. When the lights went out and the base quieted for the night, she stayed behind a while longer. The moonlight spilled through the high windows, turning the mats silver. She walked to the center, barefoot and breathed in the stillness. In her mind, she heard Forrest's words again. Mercy changes people. Then Raines's laugh. Then the faint voice of her younger self whispering, "Don't quit." All of them blended into one soft echo that felt less like memory and more like prayer. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, steady, cleansing. She let it fall on her face as she stepped into the open air, the sound mixing with her heartbeat. No more ghosts, just weather, just life. She looked up at the dark sky and said quietly, "I'm still here." The words weren't a confession, they were a promise. How does a story end when no one's keeping score anymore? Sometimes it doesn't. It just softens until only the echoes remain. Years passed. The world kept moving, new wars, new names, new uniforms filled with the same old hopes. At Fort Liberty, the combative center still opened every morning to the smell of sweat and disinfectant, the slap of mats, the rhythm of shouts. But the office with the nameplate Hawthorne B stood empty now. She had retired quietly as she'd promised herself. No ceremony, no rows of medals pinned one last time, just a signature on the discharge papers, a handshake from Rays, and a simple farewell over black coffee. "Sure you're ready?" he'd asked. She'd smiled, been ready for a long time. He tried to convince her to stay as a civilian instructor, but she only said, "Every story needs silence after the last sentence." And then she was gone. Now she lived 2 hours away in a small coastal town where the air tasted of salt and the nights hummed with crickets instead of helicopters. Her house sat at the end of a dirt road, white-painted, plain. A porch swing, a garden of stubborn roses, a mutt that followed her everywhere. Every morning she ran along the shoreline at dawn. No cadence, no stopwatch, just the sound of the ocean keeping time for her. Sometimes she stopped at the old wooden pier, leaned on the railing and watched the sun crawl up from the water. The sea looked endless, forgiving. She liked that about it. She never told anyone who she'd been. Around town she was just Miss Bin, the quiet woman who fixed her own truck and brought coffee to the fishermen when the weather turned bad. The anonymity suited her. Until one afternoon. She was sitting outside the cafe near the pier when a young woman in fatigue stopped in front of her. The uniform was crisp, the posture familiar. "Sergeant Hawthorne." It took her a second to recognize the voice. Then she smiled. "Lena Moore." The younger woman grinned, sunburned and confident. "Didn't think I'd actually find you. Everyone said you vanished." "Maybe I did," Hawthorne said. "Sit down." They talked for hours, about deployments, training, the exchange program. Moore had grown into her own legend now, decorated, respected, still carrying that cracked prayer bead bracelet on her wrist. "I kept it," she said, holding it up. "People ask where it's from. I just tell them it belonged to someone who remembered to be human." Hawthorne nodded, pride flickering quietly in her chest. "You turned out all right." Moore smiled. "Guess I had a decent teacher." When they parted, Moore saluted. Hawthorne returned it with a half-raised hand, informal, almost tender. As the young woman walked away, Hawthorne realized the world would keep making soldiers, but not all of them would lose themselves the way she once had. Some would know better. That night she sat on the porch with her dog asleep at her feet. The moon hung low and heavy over the sea. She thought about all the versions of herself that had lived and died over the years. The scared girl in Detroit, the soldier in Raqqa, the instructor who taught restraint, the woman who finally stopped fighting shadows. None of them were gone. They just learned to live together. She picked up her old field notebook from the table, pages yellowed, corners frayed. Inside were names, lessons, fragments of thought. She turned to the last page and wrote one more line. Mercy is the only victory that lasts. She closed the book and placed it beside the photo of her old unit. Rains, Cooper, Mark's faces young forever. She touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "Rest easy, I'm home." The wind moved through the open window, carrying the scent of salt and rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the water. She listened, not with fear but recognition. Life was still unpredictable, still wild, but now it sounded like weather, not war. When morning came, she rose before the sun as always. The horizon glowed pale gold. She laced her boots, stepped outside, and walked toward the beach. The sand was cool under her feet, the ocean calm. She paused at the edge of the water, watching the first light catch on the waves. Each one folded and unfolded, like breath. For a long time she just stood there, hands in her pockets, letting the tide wash over her boots. No uniform, no rank, just a woman who had given the world everything it asked for and somehow still had something left, quiet, steady dignity. She thought of the laughter from years ago, the mat at Camp Pendleton, the 4 Marines she dropped in 15 seconds. It felt like another lifetime. Maybe it was. Back then, strength had meant proving herself. Now it meant never needing to again. The sun broke fully, spilling light across the water. She closed her eyes and let the warmth touch her face. The narrator's voice in her head, the one that had told her when to fight, when to run, was silent at last. She smiled. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And that was enough.